Welcome to the Atlassian AMA on Agile at Scale. I'm here with Ashley Faus and Kelly Drozd from Atlassian. We're going to start in just about a minute, but in case you're joining us, just wanted to welcome you to the chat. And by chat, I mean the LinkedIn discussion. So if you have any questions that you want to submit, we already have a ton of questions submitted on the Atlassian community, but you can add more questions as we go along, or if you want, comment, and perhaps we'll pull your comments up as you type them out. Again, I'm Christine, kicking off but not fielding questions for our AMA on Agile at Scale. And as the banner says across the bottom, we're going to start in just a minute. Wanted to give a few folks time to attend and get themselves situated because this is a heavy topic. It's a lot of opinions here. A lot of different people like to practice this differently, but we're here to just share our knowledge. And by we, I mean Ashley and Kelly are here to share their knowledge. They are both very experienced and have worked with a ton of customers on Agile at Scale. And so they'll be pulling from what they know and when relevant, sharing some links or resources to where you can go for more information. I'll do my best to be behind the scenes and pull up links and share them with you at the bottom of the screen with little banners, and you'll be able to, in the recording or live, see what websites or other references we're talking about in real time. With that very verbose intro said, let's kick us off. Let us talk first about context. What are we even talking about? Let's level set. What does it even mean to scale Agile across a company? I know that we've all heard the term Agile. We know what it means. Well, maybe we know what it means when we were Agile as a team, but is that even different when you scale it across a company? And what does it look like? Ashley and Kelly, feel free to get started.
I'll take a quick crack at it. So I think it's fairly well known, right? When you think about scaling Agile across a company, I think most people think scaling something like Scrum or scaling more of the processes and practices. But I will say, and I know that Ashley will agree, it's a lot more than that. When you think about, transformation of any type, let's call it Agile, it is essentially change management that really never ends. So when you think about taking something that works and scaling across a company, it's not only people and a mindset change, it's also the process and the tools you use to create efficiencies across your teams. And I mean that in not a debatable way. I think there's a lot of examples of where it goes right and goes wrong. But Ashley, I'm sure I missed some things in there.
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing is the distinction between doing Agile and having an Agile and iterative and continuous improvement and continuous feedback mindset. So we see this a lot, even whether people are just starting with it or whether they're doing it at scale of like, we're going to now mandate that everyone has a daily stand-up, or we're going to mandate that everyone does a retrospective. See, we're doing the Agiles now. And it's like, that's not going to work. So I think to Kelly's point, it really is a continual shift. And when you start talking about scaling it across the company, you have to make sure that everybody is aligned on the goals, the outcomes, and the impact, not just we're doing the thing and therefore we are Agile. Like it's a really, I think, fine distinction. I've heard this from a number of people when I've talked to my colleagues at other places. One of my friends actually called me and she's like, we have to do Agile now. And I was like, oh dear, I was like, how's that going? She said, not well. It was a struggle. So I think that will be a guiding principle and theme throughout this conversation today.
Really good context setting. And I feel like you've already started talking about things to consider along the way. You were alluding to, there are pitfalls. There are different ways of doing it. So why don't we get into that? And just to call out to the commenters who are asking if this is being recorded. This is being recorded. So if you're missing something, you can always come back. But Kelly, Ashley, talk to us a little bit more about what you were alluding to. Are there pitfalls? Are there considerations for a company that's just starting to scale, or for a company that's been doing this for a while? And are there considerations for them?
Yeah, I think Ashley said it really well, just talking about going through the motions. So it's kind of interesting, right? So I'll pull from my past experience. So prior to coming in at Atlassian, I kicked off what we call Agile Transformation. I hate even saying it because it's such a buzzword, but we had some specific problems that we were trying to solve that spanned people in the way that we work, in the tools that we use, in the process that we had, really to bring people together and how we got feedback from our customers. So there's a variety of problems that we were really trying to uncover. And the interesting thing is the organization I worked at was not a new organization. It's a fairly large organization, and we needed a framework to start. And so we started looking at the problems that we were solving and borrowed from our friends in software development and started exploring what does something like Scrum work for our teams? And in some cases it did, in some cases it didn't, but we needed a framework to start to really build the path of how do we need to work together. And from that, it really transformed into how our teams needed to work. Practices changed. 2-week sprints didn't really work for us. Like a lot of people said that I know in the podcast, Dominique talks about that a little bit, like 2-week sprints don't work. And I know that Kelvin had a really good comeback to that you can learn in 2 weeks. But there's just a lot of things that it worked for us in the problems that we were trying to solve to start with essentially a template and continue to iterate on how our teams work and the practices that we used. And as we scaled that from team to team, it continued to change and evolve.
I think the other big thing, Kelly has shown me some of the work that she did. She's being very modest about her work on that transformation project. I think the most fascinating foundational piece of work that you did there was mapping out how the work was actually happening. So there's an additional practice or field of study, whatever you want to call it, around value stream mapping. And usually that mindset is around trying to find waste or inefficiencies in the process. And it usually kind of gets a bad rap as almost like a cost-cutting measure instead of looking at how do we optimize the ways that we're working and where are things going wrong at the intersections, where are things going wrong at the handoff. And so I think, Kelly, when you showed me, like, you mapped out the whole process and there were so many like circular steps of like, well, ask Ashley, well, ask Kelly. Well, no, but then Kelly said to ask Ashley, but then Ashley said to ask Kelly. Okay, why can't either of these people make a decision? Something is broken there. Great, we found a broken part. And the answer may or may not be a specific artifact or ritual. It may just be that there was some step that made sense in the past and it no longer makes sense. And so I think that mapping out those dependencies, mapping out the current workflow and understanding where those friction points are happening, that helps you hone in on which pieces to tackle first. I think the other mistake a lot of people make is they decide that they're going to tackle the whole system. The entire team or the entire organization has to do all the steps right now instead of looking at the highest friction points and attacking those first. So I think mapping out how it's currently being done and where the maybe 3 to 5 biggest points of friction are. And then looking at, okay, what are those friction points? Is it a time zone issue? Is it a communication issue? Is it a bureaucracy issue, a paperwork issue? Is it a technology issue? This thing doesn't integrate, so we're doing it manually. That then helps you diagnose where to point your solution-oriented actions.
Awesome. I feel like what we both have said are evergreen considerations. Anytime, you can always be thinking about those things. This is something I'm curious about, but thankfully someone already previously submitted this question. Has that idea of there are principles and considerations that will apply no matter what, has that changed over time? Like, was scaling Agile 10 years ago, 5 years ago, different from scaling Agile today? I mean, think about when the Agile Manifesto was created. Would you say that there's been an evolution to the way that the practice of scaling Agile has happened over time?
Yeah, so I think the practice definitely evolves over time. And I was having this conversation a couple of months ago, talking about the Agile Manifesto, obviously coming up on year 20, right, of the Agile Manifesto. And I was reminded very kindly that Agile ways of working are closer to 40 years old, right? And so, 20 years of moving from more of a waterfall where you're doing a lot of planning ahead, and it could take years to get anything in the hands of your customers to get feedback. Obviously, as time goes on and technology goes, expands the way that it has in 40 years, and things happen more quickly and technology can come to market a lot faster. Yeah, I think that the manifesto definitely holds up, but I was pointing out like the customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and knowing that that came out 20 years ago and thinking what was happening in technology 20 years ago, that's very different. I'm not saying specifically that that was put in there when you were creating a tool and selling it to a customer specifically, but now our customers are a human being like me. Someone is selling me something every day. And so you're not necessarily collaborating with your customers every day over contract negotiation, but you need to be working with your customers and have a pulse on how they're working, what they're doing, the problems that you're solving. And I think in your podcast episode or our podcast episode, Dominique brings up a really good point, thinking of like user experience design and research and insights and how that works with the product teams and all the other teams that are involved in taking a product to market. You think of marketing. So I'm part of a marketing team, as is Ashley. So I'm part of not a triad, but a quad, where I work with our product manager and our designer, our product designer, and our engineering manager. And that didn't necessarily happen 20 years ago. And so again, I think that the Agile Manifesto is really great and it's super helpful between the values and the principles. But I think that the practices have definitely evolved over time because there's more people involved. And everything is technology. So there's a lot more teams that are doing the technology work than your traditional, your IT teams where you're serving internal customers or serving one external customer. Everything is technology. And so it just evolves so rapidly. So again, some of these hold up, but definitely the practices and who's involved has changed over time to include sometimes an entire organization more than just your traditional technology teams that we thought of 20 years ago.
Yeah, there's a commentary I can see on LinkedIn that's saying, it's a framework, not a standard. And that is very true, that it's not. And then I see a comment below that saying, what's the main difference between Agile and Waterfall? And I think that these two comments go hand in hand, because with this bigger question of like, how has it changed over the last 20 years? So if you look at things like, so I work on Agile and DevOps topics. So I'm pretty deep in kind of the software space, but then on the flip side, as a marketer, I'm seeing this transformation as well. When we moved from everything on-prem and everything, a company basically owning the entire process. So from a waterfall standpoint, you would basically gather all of your requirements, and then you would lay out all of your milestones, and then you would need to hit each of those milestones. Otherwise, the project would get pushed. And that used to work because from a manufacturing standpoint, you had to go out and say, I need to buy this many silicone chips, or I need to buy this many motherboards, or this many circuits, or whatever the thing was to build the computer, to then, or build the box, build your server, to put it in your closet or your server room. And so, yeah, you had to know in advance, okay, well, how much are you supporting? How will the organization grow over the next however many years? We need to build that into the plan, and you had to do all of that up front. And then if you missed one milestone, your whole project got thrown off track. So that's waterfall. If you basically say each of these projects has a dependency. If you look at the shift now to cloud, where you can just spin things up, you can spin up VMs, you can spin up containers, you can spin up an instance like that. Now, all of a sudden, you don't have to know your requirements months or years in advance. You can know your requirements hours in advance. You can even only have those requirements for a few hours if you're running tests or you're processing large amounts of data, for example. You say, okay, great, I need this amount of compute power for a couple hours, spin it up, spin it down. And so that's kind of that Agile mindset. If we think about that from a marketing standpoint, again, you used to be doing these large scale billboards, you used to be doing these trade shows, and it took months because everything had to be printed and then shipped. And then it had to stay up there for, days or weeks to be able to recoup the ROI. Now, all of a sudden, you could do everything digitally, and you could push a paid ad on social media in less than a week if you're fast with your design processes, right? So all the way around, it's the way that you go about gathering your requirements, the lead time that you need for shipping no longer requires dealing with all of those physical barriers the way that it used to. And so I think, to Kelly's point, we do have to keep evolving, and that principle of continuous improvement and continuous feedback, that's the thing that is the core and is going to continue to hold true no matter what technology does, no matter what the ways of working do. And then, yeah, if you start putting in a bunch of bureaucracy, it's like, okay, but now you've removed the continuous part if you keep putting up these roadblocks.
Awesome. I love the conversation that we could talk about for a long time. I feel like these kinds of questions are questions that everybody has, but I'm going to switch gears. We're about halfway through the AMA. So in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to go to very specific questions that have been asked that I think are pretty unique. And so instead of me recapping them, I'm just going to be throwing up on the bottom of the screen banners that show exactly what the questions submitted look like. This is our first one from Bill. Asking about why anyone would try to scale something before confirming that they have evidence. Take it away.
I think this is, Bill, I think this is a really great question. We were talking a little bit about this earlier today, and I think that sometimes Agile, especially Agile is at scale, something that is bought, something that is a promised like endpoint. And so I think organizations could potentially start to think about scaling before they start to think about what are the problems that we're solving and how could we figure out if this works as a team level, and if we apply this framework, like if we apply Scrum, is it going to accomplish the goals that we have, or are we signing up Scrum to do more than we should expect of it? So I guess why someone would scale before they confirm that there's evidence is not really a good answer, other than they want something that might have been sold to them or they saw work in another organization. And the truth of the matter is, just because it works at company A doesn't mean it's going to work for company B. The way that organizations are structured, the problems that they're trying to solve, the dependencies between teams can be very, very different. So I think it is smart, sort of how you mentioned, it is good to be able to try at first and validate that, yes, this is in fact doing what we need it to for our business or for our teams, before we start to scale. And again, like anything, it should be an iteration, right? So Ashley and I were talking about this, like there is a promised end state with Agile, but I think it's a long process of continuing to evaluate, again, what we're signing up Agile to do and evaluating what we're trying to get out of it and what those goals are and setting milestones and continuing to shift your plan based on, how it's working for the teams, how it's working for the business, and then choosing when to scale and how scaling actually looks. Just applying a blanket framework to scale might not be the best option, but it could definitely be a starting point, and is a starting point for a lot of companies. So I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer, but in my experience, it's definitely good to start small. That's what I did in my past life, and it definitely worked. We learned a ton from the teams, and we learned a lot to be able to kind of sell up to our leadership to get buy-in of like why we should continue spending our time changing the way that teams work and work together, and the tools that we use. Again, tools do not make you Agile, but they definitely help teams work together. So I'm not sure if I answered your question 100%. I think it always depends, but yeah, Ashley.
Yeah, I think I'll let you keep going on this next question, Kelly, since it's getting into kind of some of the nitty-gritty definitions. I have an opinion on this, but I will let you take it.
Oh, yeah. So I think the simple answer is Sprint is a specific Scrum term, just like product owner and Scrum Master. So I think that the term iteration can be a little bit loose. I know that when the new Scrum guide came out, they changed some of their like timeframes to be a little bit more open and flexible than they had necessarily in the past. So a sprint traditionally, I think, is most common. It's 2 weeks, right? Where iterations just depend on what the team determines an iteration. Like, what is the amount of time that you need to build something or learn something or research something that provides value potentially to your customers or to the business. So that iteration could be a week, it could be 2 weeks, it could be a longer time period, it could be months. I mean, I think it really depends, and teams have to determine that together. But again, just to recap, sprint is specifically a Scrum term, or iteration, I feel like can be used a little bit more generally. Ashley, do you have another take on that?
No, that was my take. I was going to say, I think that the iteration, to your point, is the encompassing thing that you're trying to get to for each of the sprints. So, all right, Antoine, working in a big company with dozens of teams that have their own methodology, how would you assist them from the perspective of a Jira administrator? Yeah, I think so like most things, I think this depends. And I would actually suggest there's a couple of different threads in our Atlassian community from Jira administrators talking about how they've done very specific things. One example that I love, we actually did an AMA with Twitter and talked with some of their administrators. And the thing that I love that they did is they laddered everything up all the way from kind of the story and issue level up to the full company OKR and visions. And so no matter where you were in the organization, you could see how your work contributed to that bigger vision. So, from a zoomed out perspective, I think that, whether you're an administrator, if you can partner with, leadership and people who are setting the priorities to really map, okay, why do we need these fields? Okay, it's so that it can track up to this OKR. Or why do we need these workflows? It's because it tracks up to this vision. We've seen this sometimes where people get really excited and they're like, everything needs a custom field. And then the custom fields kind of become useless because there's like 5,000 of them. So I think as an administrator that has that cross-functional view, helping to educate the other teams about the type, like noticing that this same type of workflow seems to be common across a number of different teams. And so is there a place for automation? Is that something that you could help another team understand? Oh, I see you're doing this workflow. It looks very similar to this other one. Maybe you should try using this workflow as a base, or maybe there's some automation rules that would be helpful. So I think there's a balance of the super tactical for things like custom fields, workflows, automation, all the way up to helping teams map their work up to the bigger vision and OKRs. Kelly, I don't know, you've definitely worked very closely with some administrators. So if you have tips as well.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And before joining Atlassian, my team and I actually were on the admin side of the organization that we worked in specifically. So work really closely with our organizational Jira admin and our Confluence admin. And the one thing that we really focused on, just like I said with Agile, like what is the problem that a tool like, what are the problems that our team's having, and how could a tool like Jira Software help them? So one thing that we found out when we started, one thing for us is obviously transparency and visibility for teams, and be able to see what is happening, tell the whole story, not necessarily for leadership, so the team can understand what's going on, what are the priorities, where is their work, what is getting held up. And as we definitely matured, we used a lot more features to really understand, what is the team's throughput? Are we doing the right work? But when it comes to like your question of like how, with dozens of teams that have their own methodology, how do you assist them? I would say spend a lot of time with them. Joe from Twitter talked a lot about that, like spending time understanding how your teams work so you can help them be more efficient, or help them integrate their tools, or help them set up automation to save time. Ashley talked a lot about, workflows and custom fields and things like that. I think it's really good to start as simple as possible and continue to customize using Jira or using Confluence, the instance to definitely help your teams. I know as you start to talk about teams of teams and dozens of teams, I guarantee you're probably having leadership also come to you as a Jira admin, trying to see how leadership can get visibility. So at some point, if you haven't had it yet, and you're looking for those higher level views, there's a lot that Jira can offer as far as visibility. Something like advanced roadmaps that can help see work across teams of teams and how that work ladders up in that hierarchy. But first and foremost, understand your teams. They're the ones that are working and using these tools every single day. And I would say that setting it up so it helps them and helps the teams of teams is going to be your best bet. So spend a lot of time with them, understand how they work. We did a lot of whiteboarding to understand how teams were currently working before we actually did anything in Jira. And as things changed, we would kind of go back to how are things set up now? How do they have to change? How is the team changed? So we were constantly working with our teams because they were improving their process. And with that, they realized they need more things, or they need to change their workflow. They needed additional fields, needed automation, they needed more visibility. So yeah, we wouldn't have known that if we didn't spend time with them one-on-one. And then looking at, teams of teams, like what can we standardize, what makes sense to standardize, what doesn't make sense to standardize, always thinking about our teams, because we didn't want to make any decisions that made Jira really hard for them to work in their own methodologies and have a workflow that meets really how they work. So I hope that answered your questions. I'm happy to talk more about it. Agile operations.
Yeah, Natalia. So we actually have, if you go to Atlassian.com/DevOps, we have a whole bunch of information about DevOps practices, DevOps metrics, kind of the differences between Agile and DevOps, how Agile methodologies kind of fit into the planning phase of the DevOps lifecycle, versus, things like CI/CD, version control, comprehensive testing, automation, et cetera, throughout the rest of the DevOps lifecycle. So Atlassian.com/DevOps, you can see it on the ticker going across, but we talk a lot about the operations side of kind of Agile on the DevOps microsite. You can get a lot of good information there.
Cool.
How do you use Agile scaling for a service product with a limited supply? So I'm assuming the context on this is something like you're billing for time, like you're a consultant or a lawyer or something like that. Kelly, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I think my thoughts are, again, Agile is not necessarily about trying to push more faster. It's about quality and solving customer problems in a way that makes sense. And so even if you are, a human that only has so much time and expertise to share, so you wouldn't like apply Agile to the humans. Like that's not really how it works. There's definitely some underlying tools and processes to help them do that. But at the end of the day, like the time they spend helping clients, that's not, you're not going to sprint that into faster help for clients necessarily. I think that there are some things, if we were to go back to the fundamental principles around continuous improvement and around that ability to use things and, have good processes and guardrails, there might be some questions that your clients ask all the time that maybe you make a playbook to be able to make that more efficient delivery. But I would almost say I kind of reject the premise of this because it feels a little bit like you're trying to Agile the humans, and I don't think that's quite right. But Kelly, do you have thoughts on that?
My thought is, I'm not actually sure what this question is asking. I don't want to not answer it, but Shelly, if you have more information or can provide more information, I'd be happy to attempt to answer it. So Ashley, I would say I agree with what you said. I just don't want to answer Shelly's question incorrectly because I'm not 100% sure I am sure what she's asking. How Agile can work when there is no development happening. So I think I understand the question. So if you just mean from an operations standpoint, let me think. So in my last role, I worked in marketing operations and there was no development happening, but there was work happening. There were campaigns happening. And so I would say that the team that I led, we had anywhere from 6 to 10 people on our team at any given time. And we took an Agile approach on how we supported our marketing organizations at the team that we support in the teams that we supported. So it's like anything, we had some short-term and longer-term goals, but we would get together as a team on a monthly basis and really prioritize what we had upcoming. We would meet weekly and do kind of a stand-up just to check in on how our initiatives were going, and we would constantly reprioritize. We did retrospectives to make sure that we knew how the team was doing and how we were working as a team, and we would continue to evolve our practices, all while trying to drive change across the organization. So we borrowed from really Scrum and Kanban. I wouldn't want to call it Scrumban. People will probably kill me for saying that, but we did. So we took a more agile approach to how we supported our internal customers, which were our marketing teams. So I don't know if that's the exact question you're having, but our teams weren't doing any development. We were working on more campaign work, which traditionally is a lot more waterfall. You have a lot of moving pieces, a ton of dependencies. It's a lot harder to not necessarily to test, but sometimes it takes a lot longer than developing software or getting feedback from customers, because it's a little bit different. And I could have a long debate on how it's different for marketing than software teams, but I hope that answered your question, sort of. But you could definitely ask again, and I'm happy to follow up. If you're in the community, you could tag me to the post, and we could chat offline or talk it through.
From Anton, what are the best practices when it comes to promoting the necessary changes? So change management attitudes, what are the pitfalls? Are there any effective shortcuts? So we saw this too. There was another question in the community asking, like, how do you get leadership or executives on board with this? I think there's a couple of things, and it does always go back to, what are the goals, and are you aligned on the outcomes that you want to achieve? That's the first thing. I think the second thing is going around and socializing that idea based on the goals and the outcomes, not based on, we need to make these 500 changes today and we're going to be done with those 500 changes tomorrow. So the elements of, first, you have to be aligned on the goals. Second, you have to make sure that the milestones for the projects are reasonable for the goals. And then third is, you have to put in a reasonable time horizon. So I think the other place where people have these pitfalls is they either say, oh, this is a 10-year initiative. Okay. Most people are not going to be signing up for a 10-year initiative. That is too long. If you say, oh, it's a 1-quarter initiative, that's also highly unlikely. You might be able to have some milestones or phases, but having the time horizon incorrectly mapped to your goals, that's another thing, that when you go to leadership and you give them these outlandish time horizons, immediately there's skepticism of, like, this seems like a lot of work for 1 quarter, or like, it's going to take us 10 years. Like, we're not committing to that. So packaging it up in a way that is realistic, that it might be a 1 to 2 year initiative. It's going to have phases. It's going to start potentially in this team or this organization. We're going to pilot it. We're going to incorporate those learnings. And then making sure that they're on board with the goals. Again, if you come out with these crazy goals of, like, we're going to pivot and do this other thing, it's like, what, this initiative is tied to something we don't even do. So making sure that it's grounded in reality with a reasonable future-looking time frame. Kelly, any additional things to add?
Yeah, so I just got really honed in on the pitfalls, and it reminded me of A, the experience that I had, but B, John Cutler and I had a conversation back in the spring, and I've heard this before, where you talk about, and Andrea Freier from Agile Sherpa said this, leading with the why, not the way. And so I feel like, because Agile is such a buzzword, people tend to lead with, we're going to be Agile, or we're going to do Scrum, rather than, again, the problems that you're going to solve. So if you stop to understand the problems of your organization, how Agile might solve for that, and then strip the language of it and just focus on really what's in it for you or that person. So, like, what is, from a change management standpoint, what is in it for this team to think differently, to work differently, to use maybe different tools, to maybe change your leadership style completely. You have to understand the current environment that teams are in, understand what their current pain points are, and stick to how you're going to solve their pain specifically versus leading with Scrum or leading with sprints or leading with Agile or leading with digital transformation. Like, I feel like those can go really wrong. So I would avoid being really dogmatic with and being really careful about the language that you used. So that was a problem that we had as well. And we had to start to backtrack to think about, what are we calling, like, how are we referring to what we're doing? And if we start to lead with things like Agile or Scrum or Kanban or Scrumban, and certain people don't feel like it's adding any value to the work that they're doing, or we're hitting our goals, it's really easy to say Agile's not working, when the fact of the matter is, if this is your problem and you're trying to solve for it and it's not being solved for, it's not necessarily Agile. Maybe there's just a different approach. So just be really careful about the terms that you use. And I think that comes from spending some time on the front end to uncover what you're trying to solve for and being specific on what you're going to do to solve that problem. And sometimes take the language out of it, or gut check what language you're using. That's really important.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, and then we can definitely follow up in the community. So yeah, plenty of time. I have some thoughts on this, again, coming from the DevOps side of the house as well. So you've heard the buzzword Devsecops, which is basically, again, what traditionally happened back in the day is you would go through kind of all of your steps. You would have development. They would then hand it off. QA would say, like, okay, this is ready to go live. And then security would come in and kind of bolt it on and be like, no, now we have to secure the thing. And again, that worked when you basically made the thing and then you put it in a closet and you could lock the closet. And now that's not the case. So DevSecOps, there's a couple of ways that gets incorporated. Usually you would have something like a central security team that kind of vets any of the libraries or shared tooling across the teams. And then each team would have potentially a DevSecOps engineer or an embedded security engineer who sits within their teams that, writes kind of the security scans that are specific to that piece of software or that product, and making sure that, okay, are we using the right libraries? Are we using the right testing suite? Are we have we installed all the right patches? Are we up to date? Those kinds of things. So central security team would pair well with your DevSecOps or your embedded security engineer. The other big thing about this is basically from an education standpoint, again, Agile does not mean you're thrashing about and you're throwing things away all the time, or you're just picking up the fanciest new thing. It doesn't mean you're going and just installing all of these software so you can just hack through and get things done. It's not about being frantic. So when you talk about how do you maintain security when you're using Agile methodologies, part of that answer is that you need to be thoughtful about those changes and you need to be educating people. So it's almost funny at Atlassian, they've done such a good job educating us about phishing that literally anything that comes out that hasn't been kind of formally announced, employees go nuts. We're like, is this a phishing attempt? Is someone trying to hack me? Like, we delete stuff. And so now we have a whole kind of internal rollout for things that are going to be a big system change, because they know employees are not going to actually click the link because they've educated us so well. And so, yes, now they have to take more time on the front end to build those communications and alert us that a change is coming. But once they do it, everybody does what they're supposed to do because it's been communicated properly. And so if you were to put that in the mindset of Agile, you would say, oh, well, you've wasted your time that now you have to do this front end communication. But if you look at it, you see that you've maintained security, you've reduced the risk, and in fact, you've accelerated the change because you took that time on the front end. So two sides of the coin. There's the DevSecOps side of the coin. Again, we have a number of articles about best practices for that on Atlassian.com/DevOps. And then it's also just a question of, it's not about being frenetic or frantic or hustling. It's about investing time in the right places. So Kelly, I see you're kind of laughing as well. If you have anything to add about that before we sign off.
Yeah, I think it was the conversation. So we did we did a live stream with Susie, and was it Patrick? About Devsecops back in
I think so.
May. It was just a really interesting episode. And I will say that this is not my area of expertise. And I learned a lot from that. So I don't know how hard or quickly we can get that link, but I found it to be a really fascinating conversation. And that's all. I have no comments. I feel like you know a ton about this from the work that you do and the teams that you work with.
I'm going to run over to YouTube right quick and see if I can get,
that's great.
See what I can get here, because I think we've got it handy. Here we go. Devsecops. Let me grab this. And I will put it in the chat, and our handy producer, Christine, can pop it into LinkedIn. And that would be a perfect thing to end with, is another place to follow up. So I will pass it back to you, Christine, for last words and where to go. You can get that link. We'll also pop it into the thread on the community, and we can put it into the LinkedIn comments for you to follow up.
You basically did my job for me, Ashley. I just wanted to say thank you then for actually Kelly answering a bunch of questions. And I know that there were more questions on the thread. I know that in the Teamwork Lab on Atlassian community, there were more questions, but the conversation doesn't have to end here. Feel free to go to our community, community.atlassian.com. You can tag Ashley and Kelly in there. Also, if you'd like to share this recording with people who weren't able to join us live, once this is over, we'll be able to export the video and post it in that bit.ly link. I would have put the full link, but it is very long, and I don't think anyone wants to retype that. So with that said, thank you so much for joining us. This is Ashley and Kelly from Atlassian's team, who have a lot of experience in Agile at scale. So if you have more questions for them, again, please go to the community, ask more questions, and hope to continue the conversation there. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.